Hi, and welcome to the 2024-25 FAFSA form preview presented by the Office of Student Financial Services at Marietta College. My name is Emily. I'm the counselor in the office, and today I'll be walking you through the 24-25 FAFSA form. So let's get started. In order to access the form, you will want to go to studentaid.gov. You can also access other services from studentaid.gov, including accepting federal loans through the Master Promissory Note and entrance counseling, loan forgiveness and repayment options for once you leave school or graduate, and learning about different types of federal student aid, including work study, grants, and loans. Once you access studentaid.gov, you'll be greeted by this homepage. In order to create an account, you'll want to click this top right icon saying Create Account. Creating an account, or what's called an FSA ID, is required in order to fill the FAFSA form, and every person contributing to a student's FAFSA form must have their own FSA ID, including the student's parents or step-parents, or the student's spouse, if applicable. Once you click the link to create an account, you'll be taken to this page. It will let you know what you'll need, which includes your own social security number and your own email address. In order to create the FSA ID, you'll need to provide your personal and contact information. Please have your social security number on hand. In order to be eligible for federal student aid, students must be a U.S. citizen, an eligible non-citizen, and they must have a valid social security number, with the exception of students from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, or the Republic of Palau. Please note that contributors other than the student, so for instance, a student's parent, does not necessarily need to have a social security number in order to contribute to the student's FAFSA form. When you start creating your FSA ID, it will take you to step 1 of 7, which is filling out the personal information. This will be filling out the student, parent, step-parent, or student spouse, first name, middle initial, last name, date of birth, and their social security number if applicable. Please be aware that phone numbers, email addresses, and social security numbers can only be associated with one FSA ID. You cannot use the same email address across multiple IDs. Students and contributors are highly recommended to create their own FSA IDs as well. If you're unsure if you or one of your contributors already has an FSA ID, Federal Student Aid will alert you if you try to create another one and your social security number is already in their system. Some other things to note: students are highly recommended not to use their school email when creating their FSA ID, as these emails may become inactive after the student graduates or leaves school. You will also need to create a username and a password that will be used to log in every time you want to access your FAFSA form or other aspects of the Federal Student Aid website. It is also recommended to set up your mobile phone for account access in order to use it for two-step verification or in case you get locked out of your account. The next steps of the FSA ID creation include creating the username, the password, and again, registering your mobile phone. You'll also be prompted to select a communications preference for federal student aid documents. These will be either sent by email or by post-email, depending on how you would like those sent to you. Additionally, you will create challenge questions. These will help serve you to log in case, for instance, you forget your password or your username. Please note these answers are not case sensitive. And once you've completed the previous steps, you will verify and confirm your entered information. You'll also be required to agree to Federal Student Aid's terms and conditions, which you can read before you agree. Lastly, you will want to set up two-step verification. This will be set up with either your email, your mobile phone, or both. They'll be used to recover your FSA ID in case you forget any part of your login. You'll want to verify both email and phone. There is also a choice to use an authenticator app as well. Additionally, you will receive what's called a backup code from Federal Student Aid. This is generated by them, and it's used in case you lose access to any of the other methods you use for two-step verification. Please keep this safe and store it in case you ever need it. And now you've successfully created your FSA ID. You will not have full access to everything that Federal Student Aid has to offer through your FSA ID for at least 1 to 3 days, as it has to be completely verified first. However, one of the components that you do have immediate access to is filling out a FAFSA form for the first time. Now, let's say that you've already created your FSA ID. To log in with the FSA ID, you'll just need to log in with your email, username, phone number, and password, and say you've already forgotten your password. You can click the link to retrieve your account through one of the methods we discussed earlier. This is the screen that you will see once you click login on the Federal Student Aid site. So logging in, again, you'll be prompted to use two-step verification in order to completely log into your account. And once you're logged into the Federal Student Aid website, you will want to click Start New Form on the page that you first get to once you log in. So we're going to go through filling out the FAFSA form for dependent students. Most undergrad students are going to be dependent students. So the form can actually be started by either the student or a student's parent. Depending on who logs in, you'll want to select the correct version of the form. So again, we're going to be starting the form as a student in this example. Once the student begins the form, they'll be taken to 4 screens that will contain onboarding videos created by Federal Student Aid. They will introduce you to different aspects of the FAFSA form and different aspects of Federal Student Aid. The second video in particular talks about the role of what's called a contributor. Contributor is new for 24-25. The term basically just means that anyone who is required to provide information, sign the student's FAFSA, and provide consent and approval for the use of the federal tax information. So that could be the student's parents or step-parents, and the student's spouse if the student is married. The third video talks about what consent and approval is. Again, this is a new term for 24-25. Consent and approval just basically means that you're allowing the sharing of your personally identifiable information entered on the FAFSA form to be shared with the IRS. You're also allowing your federal tax information, or FTI, to be transferred to the FAFSA form from the IRS. The use of your FTI to determine your aid eligibility. The sharing of FTI with selected schools and state agencies, and the reuse of federal tax info for other FAFSA forms if, say, the parent is filling out a form for multiple students. The fourth and final video explains what happens after you have submitted the FAFSA. Typically, it takes 1 to 3 days to process, and the student will receive what's called a FAFSA submission summary, which entails the student's estimated eligibility, the answers that they supplied on the form, information for the schools they selected, and next steps. Schools typically receive the FAFSA form within 1 to 5 days after the form has been submitted. And once the school does receive it, they'll reach out to the student about next steps in case they need to supply more information. And they'll also package the student with their financial aid offer once the FAFSA form is ready to go. Once the student has reviewed all the intro onboarding videos, they must verify their identity information. So this is the student's name, date of birth, social security number, their email address, and the mobile phone they supplied when they created their account. Please be aware that if the student realizes that any of that information is inaccurate, they will have to update their FSA ID account settings before continuing on with the form. They'll also be asked to update their mailing address as well. This can be done on the form itself. The student must also confirm their state of residence. If the student has always been a resident of that state, they will just need to enter the month and the year that they were born. The student will then be prompted to provide consent and approval. Again, this is supplying tax information from the IRS to the FAFSA and all the other aspects of consent and approval that we discussed earlier. They must provide this even if they did not file taxes for 2022. And the student will not be eligible for federal student aid without consent and approval being provided. The student, when they get to the consent and approval page, will be greeted with a summary and also some more information about what consent and approval means in greater detail. They'll also be asked to provide it by clicking approve at the bottom of the screen. After they complete that, they will be taken to the next section, which is personal circumstances. This section is used to determine the student's dependency status, so whether the student is considered dependent or independent. The form will ask about the student's current marital status, their college grade level, whether they've already completed their bachelor's degree by the 2024 and 25 school year start, along with other personal circumstance questions. And here's an example of what those screens will look like. Typically, most students are going to be selecting single or never married. They will also be coming in as a first-time freshman unless they are a returning student, and unless they've completed their bachelor's degree and are hoping to start their master's degree program. They will be clicking no on when they receive the question, when the student begins the 24-25 school year, will they have their first bachelor's degree? Again, we're going on to what's called the personal circumstance questions. In these questions, if the student's situation applies to any of the listed circumstances, then they would be considered an independent student. Otherwise, they are considered dependent and will need to have at least one parent contribute to their form before submitting. Here are all the different circumstances that the student could potentially be an independent student if it applies to them. So that includes if the student is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces or is currently serving, if the student has dependents that rely on them, if the student is an orphan, ward of the court, or was in foster care, if they were an emancipated minor, or if the student was in a legal guardianship with someone other than a parent or step-parent. In addition, if the student answered that they were married in the previous questions, then they would also be considered an independent student. And also if they answered that they were going on to complete a degree after their bachelor's degree, that would also be considered an independent student. So here are some more additional circumstance questions. If the student at any time on or after July 1st, 2023 was unaccompanied and either homeless or at risk of being homeless, they would also be considered what is called an independent student. And before I go over student unusual circumstances, I would like to also say that if the student is going to be turning 24, or in another way of saying it, if the student was born before January 1st, 2001, they would be considered an independent student as well. So that is where the age stipulation comes in. If the student was born after January 1st, 2001, and none of the situations we've talked about apply to them, then they would still be considered a dependent student. And here is student unusual circumstances. We will be discussing this a little bit more later on in the video, but this also does apply to independency status. And if the student has not indicated that they have one of the previous personal circumstances we've just discussed, again, they are dependent, so they will have their parent and or step-parents consent and approval in order to receive their federal student aid. The student will then be asked some questions about their parents. So they'll be asked if their parents are married to each other. If the parents are married to each other, then the student must provide information for both of their parents. If the student's parents are not married to each other, but they do live together, then the student must also provide information for the parents, both of them as well. If the student's parents are not married to each other and do not live together, and one parent provided more financial support than the other over the past 12 months, so the 12 months prior to filling out the form, then the student must provide information for that parent that has provided the most financial support, and also that parent's spouse if that parent remarried. And here's an example of what those screens will look like if a student fits in that situation. Now, there is the question, did one parent provide more financial support than the other over the past 12 months? If that student's parents who are not together have provided equal financial support, then the student will want to put the parent that has the greater assets on their FAFSA form. The student will then fill out the information for the indicated parents and step parents if applicable. If the parent does not have a social security number, this does not exclude the student from receiving federal student aid eligibility. This parent does not necessarily need to have a social security number in order to contribute to the form. They will just need to click, my parent does not have an SSN. And then once the student fills out this information, they will click send invite, and the parent will receive an email inviting them to complete their portion of the FAFSA. Now, one thing to note that we have seen is that if the parent's name is put on not exactly as it is legally on their documentation, so say the student puts Becky instead of Rebecca, that might hinder the parent's ability to access the form. So be sure that all legal names are going on the form. Next, the student will fill out the demographics section of the form. These questions do not impact the student's eligibility. They are used just for information gathering by federal student aid. These questions do include students' gender, ethnicity, etc. And the FAFSA will also ask some more additional questions about the parents after the demographics section there. They will ask if the parent was killed in the line of duty and the parent's education status. So if they completed college, if they complete high school, etc. The last part of the demographics question asks the student about their high school completion status and where they attended. So if the student attended high school and then received a high school diploma, they will be additionally asked where they attended and graduated from. In addition, if the student received a GED, they can mark that as well, or if they were homeschooled. And here's an example of that search for the student's high school if a student received a high school diploma. The next section is the financial section. So we are done with demographics. So if the student filed their 2022 taxes, provided consent approval, and have had their FSA ID verified, their federal tax information will be transferred from the IRS, but it does not appear on the form. Some people have been concerned that it doesn't pop up on the form after they fill out the consent approval. It will transfer from the IRS. It just does not appear populated on the form itself. One thing to note is the FSA ID needs to be verified in order for all the tax information to go over. So like we discussed earlier, that ID does take a couple days to be verified completely by federal student aid. We do recommend creating the FSA ID a couple days before you fill out the FAFSA form, even if you have direct access to it immediately, just because we want everything to populate for you and you don't have to enter everything manually. Additionally, tax filing students will be asked the below additional questions. That is the amount of college grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits reported as income to the IRS, and any foreign earned income. Again, I'm just going to reiterate that if the student decides to file their FAFSA before their ID, their federal student aid ID, has been fully verified, they will have to manually enter tax information if they filed 2022 taxes. So really, we recommend parents, students, step parents, student spouse, they all create the FSA ID if they don't already have one, at least a couple days before they fill out the form, just to make sure everything's verified so there's no hiccups filling out the form. The last page of the student's financial section asks about their assets. So current total of cash, savings, and checking accounts, current net worth of any investments, and current net worth of businesses or investment firms. Oh, excuse me. Now we are moving on to the next section, which is probably the most fun section for the student, which is selecting colleges the student is interested in sending their FAFSA data to. The students can select up to 20 schools to send their FAFSA information to, and they can search the school by name or by school code. And just wanted to note that our school code at Marietta College is 003073. And again, these are what those screens are going to look like. You can search by state, city, and school name, and you can also search by federal school code. And we're almost done with the student section. So you will get a chance to review before you sign. You can open up any of those sections and see if anything was answered incorrectly and go back and change them before you sign and submit your portion of the FAFSA. And also additionally, you will see at the bottom of that screen, the contributor section, which shows who you shared your FAFSA with. So it shows you the name of your contributors and the status of where they're at with their own portions of the application. So finally, we're ready to sign. So once you've reviewed and you're ready to sign, the student will read the information provided. So they will be required to look at the information they're agreeing to, and then they will check the box at the bottom to provide their electronic signature. And then once they've clicked sign, they have completed their part of the form. So now we're ready to finish the FAFSA form as a parent. A note before we begin this part. If your parents are married and file their 2022 taxes jointly, only one parent has to complete the form as a contributor, even if you invited both. So whichever parent basically opens the form up and completes it first, that is the parent who is contributing. Again, so if your parents are married and have had their 2022 taxes filed jointly, only one has to complete as a contributor. If your parents are married and file their 2022 taxes separately, both will have to complete the form. If your parent is married to a step-parent and filed jointly with their spouse, only your parent has to complete the FAFSA form. And lastly, if your parent did not file jointly with their spouse, they will both have to contribute to the form. So that is if your parent is married to your step-parent, but they both filed separately in 2022, they'll both have to contribute. So we are now moving on to the parent filling out the form. So the parent will get an email link, and they can either click that link to be taken to the form to sign in, or they can just go to studentaid.gov, sign in, and they will get a pop-up letting them know that their student has asked for their help on the FAFSA form. Something to be aware of: incomplete FAFSA forms that have had no activity for 45 days will be deleted from the site. So once starting this portion of the form, the parent will see the same 4 onboarding videos the student saw. So if the parent would also like to view that information, it is recommended. And then after reviewing these videos, the parent will then again go and they will verify their identity information. Again, if they need to update it, they'll need to do so in their account settings. And once they have confirmed that and also confirmed their mailing address, they will be taken to the consent and approval page for themselves. Please be aware, if the parents do not provide this, the student will not be eligible for federal student aid. Providing this does not make the parent financially responsible for the student's education. And parents must provide this even if they did not file a tax return for 2022 or if they filed a foreign tax return. Again, if the parent is married and filed their tax return jointly with their spouse, only one parent needs to provide consent and approval. So if your parents are married and they file jointly, only one of the parents, so basically the parent that's filling out the form, needs to provide consent and approval. Or if your parent is married to a step parent, only your parent has to provide consent and approval. If the parent and spouse filed separately, so if your parents are married and filed separately, or if your parent is married to a step parent and they filed separately, they will both need to go in and fill out the form, and they will both need to provide consent and approval. So then we are moving on to the parent filling out their own demographic section of the form, where they will provide their current marital status as of the day they're filing the FAFSA form. Something to note, if the answer they provide to the current marital status question is different than what the student put down for the parent may be prompted to invite another contributor to the form. This is in the instance that the student put that their parent was divorced when the parent was recently remarried. The parent would have to put that they were remarried and then invite their current spouse. The parent will also be asked to provide their state of legal residence and the date they became a legal resident as well. Then they will be moving on to their own financial section. They will be asked about any federal benefits received by any member of their family. So this is just not themselves, it's also any member in their family as well. If the parent selects that they have received any of the listed benefits during 2022 or 2023, they will be exempt from listing their assets on the FAFSA form. Other questions the parent may be asked are dependent on the responses they previously provided, and those include asset information and their tax filing status. A question they will be asked that I'd like to note is family size. So family size does include the parent, their spouse, if they have one, the student they're filling the form out for, and anyone else that lives with the parent and will receive more than half their support from that parent between July 1st, 2024 and June 30th, 2025. So this also includes other dependent children who may be attending college. It is recommended to answer yes to this question because the question will ask you if you need to update family size, because it does take family size from your tax return. So even if you believe that the tax return family size is accurate, we have seen that that may not always come across correctly on the form. So it is recommended to answer yes to that question just to verify that the family size is accurate and to update if accordingly. Again, here's an example of what the family size question will look like. The question will be, is the parent's family size different from the individual's claimed on their 2022 tax return? Again, you might want to answer yes, just to make sure that that information was transferred correctly. And you would also want to update that information if you believe that it is inaccurate. Some more follow-up questions ask about the number of people in the parent's family that will be attending college during the 2024-2025 school year. The Student Aid Index does not take this number into account in the calculation. However, it is important to answer this question. For example, some state education agencies, for example, the Ohio Department of Higher Education, may take this number into account for their grant programs. And if the parent's federal tax information transfers successfully from the IRS, the parent will only be asked about the amount of college grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits reported as income, and again, any foreign tax income, or excuse me, foreign earned income in regards to their 2022 tax return information. Please note if the parent's tax filing status doesn't reflect the current marital status, so say the parent that's filling out the FAFSA was married in 2022 and filed jointly and is now divorced and not remarried or remarried to someone else, they will have to fill out the tax information fields manually. And one of the last questions that the parent will be asked in the financial section is about their assets. Again, they may be exempt from this if you indicated that you received federal benefits on that previous page a few slides back. Lastly, the parent will review their portion of the FAFSA form and sign it. And once all contributors, so once all parents, spouses, etc., have completed their portion of the form, the FAFSA form can be submitted. And once it is submitted, the student will receive an email confirmation. So we are moving on. This is going to be a little bit shorter just because it's a bit redundant on some of the slides because a lot of it will be very similar to what we've already gone over. But you can start the form as a parent. It is a little bit different, but again, much the same. So the parent will begin the form by providing the students information from the get-go. Again, so this is so that the student can be invited to contribute to their own form. They will provide the student's first name, last name, date of birth, social security number, and email address. The parent will then complete the student's dependency status questions for them. So again, these are the personal circumstance questions that relate to the student being an independent or a dependent student. After they complete that, they will have almost the exact same experience as if they were finishing the form as a parent. So they will fill out their own parent information, make sure that they confirm their identity information, etc. They will provide consent and approval, their demographics and financials, and they will invite their spouse if they are married and need to invite another contributor to the form. And after all that is done, they will review and sign the form. Moving on to the student finishing the form. So the student will receive an email invitation to complete their portion of the FAFSA form. The student will complete their portion almost exactly the same as if they had started the form. They just will have less questions because they will not need to fill out the personal circumstance questions since their parent already provided that information for them. They will confirm their identity information, provide consent and approval, list their demographics and their financials. And here's where it's a little bit different from the parent section. They will go ahead and list their colleges on their part again, just as if they started the form. And lastly, they'll review and sign. And then again, once all contributors, including the student, have completed their portion of the form can be submitted, and the student again will receive a confirmation email. Moving on to filling out the form as an independent student. So not all students fit the dependency status. Some students may be independent. So we're going to go ahead and go through what that form would look like for them. So filling out the form as an independent student, the student again will begin the form since they will not have a parent that will begin the form for them because the student does not require parents' information if they're independent. The student will go ahead and confirm their identity information and provide their mailing address if they need to update it. They will provide their state of residence and the date they became a resident and their consent and approval. Now here's where it's a little different. In the personal circumstances section is where they will indicate which circumstance applies to them to make them an independent student. So over here on the right, I do have what the current marital status screen may look like if the student is an independent student due to being married. Again, here are some more examples of what the student may select if they are an independent student. If they select any of the following situations here on the left, except for none of these apply, of course, then that would make them an independent student, as well as the other circumstances which asks about the student being unaccompanied and either homeless or at risk. If the student indicated that they were born before January 1st, 2001, are married, pursuing a master's or doctorate program, so a program that's beyond their bachelor's degree, or if any of the presented circumstances were selected in the previous line, then they're considered an independent student and do not need a parent contributor on their form. Again, most indicators of independent status require verification by the school. So the school will reach out and ask to verify the circumstance the student has selected. This must be done before financial aid can be finalized. If the student is independent due to age, this does not need to be verified, as federal student aid does verify the student's identity information when they process the FAFSA. If the student indicated that they're married, they may need to invite their spouse. This applies if the student's spouse filed their taxes separately. So if the spouse has a separate tax return, they will be invited to contribute because they will need to provide their own consent and approval and tax info. If the student and spouse filed their taxes jointly for 2022, the spouse does not need to be a contributor to the form. The student will then complete the student demographic section. This is identical to what they would have received if they were filling out the form as a dependent student. In the financial section, the student will have more questions. They'll be asked about their federal benefits, family size, number in college, and tax information. This is because I do not have a parent answering these questions for them since they are an independent student. They may also need to answer questions about their assets, again, depending on all the information they provide on the FAFSA thus far. And then the student will finish the form in much the same way as all the other examples. They will select schools, review the form and sign it. And once the student has completed it, and the student's spouse, if the student is married and if the student's spouse needs to provide consent and approval, then once everybody is done, it is signed, completed their portions, the form submitted, and again, the student receives a confirmation email. And the school will contact the student if more information is required to verify their dependency status as independent. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the unusual circumstances that we saw earlier. So again, this is a little bit new for 24-25, but there is now what's called provisional independency status. So if the student's circumstances do not apply to the normal conditions that make them independent, so all the situations that we've talked about before that make the student independent, if they do not fall under any of those, but they fall under what's called an unusual circumstance, which we will talk about here in just a second, they are granted provisional independency status. So what is an unusual circumstance? That is multiple examples. They left home due to an abusive or threatening environment. They are estranged from their parents, have refugee or asylum status and are separated from their parents, are a victim of human trafficking, are incarcerated, or otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents. This is not necessarily an inclusive list of all the examples that would make the student a provisional independent student under an unusual circumstance, but this is commonly what that situation would look like. So if the student indicated yes on that question here, I'm showing you here, do unusual circumstances prevent the student from contacting their parents, or would contacting their parents pose a risk? If the student indicates yes, they are considered provisionally independent and would fill out the form as if they're an independent student from any other circumstance. Again, with all the other independent status circumstances other than age, we would need to verify that. Schools will reach out to verify that. The student will be contacted on how to take care of that if they are marked as a provisional independent student. So next steps. So we're finally done with the FAFSA form. The form will process in about 1 to 3 days, and the student will gain access to their FAFSA submission summary, which details their estimated eligibility, the answers they provided on their form, and more information about the colleges they selected, and next steps. So that could look like if the student had made a mistake on their FAFSA that is corrected before they're able to receive financial aid packages. That may be indicated on the next step portion of their FAFSA submission summary. So schools will then receive the FAFSA information once it's submitted and processed. If your form needs a correction, so say there's an error, the schools will reach out and inform the student, and it'll also be indicated again on your FAFSA submission summary. Schools will be unable to package financial aid offers with students who have a FAFSA data that has errors in them. So we just make sure that get all those corrections completed. So next, schools will receive this FAFSA information that was submitted once it's all processed by federal student aid. If your form needs a correction, so there's a missing signature, something along those lines, schools may reach out to the student to inform them, and the student will also be informed via their FAFSA submission summary. Schools typically are unable to package financial aid offers until all corrections are made on the student's FAFSA. And if the student indicated independency status, the schools may reach out for documentation in order to verify this before packaging your financial aid offer. Some other things to note. So the student's FAFSA may be selected for verification by the school or Department of Education. Verification typically just means that they want to verify that all the information on your FAFSA data is correct. So if the student is selected, the student will need to complete this before their financial aid offer can be finalized. And once requirements and corrections are complete, so students corrected any mistakes on the FAFSA, they complete verification if they were selected, etc., they will receive a financial aid package to consider from the schools that they selected. Another thing to note, if the family feels that their 2022 tax information does not accurately reflect their current financial circumstance, they may reach out to the financial aid office at their schools that they are considering to complete a special circumstance appeal. Please be aware that federal student aid has not yet made the ability to make corrections available on the FAFSA form. So right now, even if it's telling you that you need to make a correction, that's not actually available to do at the moment. We have last heard that that should be made available mid-April. And lastly, if you have any questions about your basic eligibility notice, which again is Marietta College's version of the financial aid offer, your dependency verification if you need to verify your independent status, or just other general financial aid questions we may be able to help with, please contact our office. I have supplied the contact information below. And something else to note, if you have any questions about your FAFSA form, so it's not working, something with your form seems not correct, any issues that you might run into with the form itself, please contact Federal Student Aid. I have, again, listed their contact information below. And that completes the walkthrough for the 24-25 FAFSA form. Thank you for your patience on this long process and good luck on the form.